Hi, I am Chad Anderson of Filmmaker U, filling in for Gordon Burkell. At Filmmaker U, we create courses for film professionals to deepen and diversify their skill set. You can learn more on filmmakeru.com or follow us on Instagram at filmmaker_u. Every week, we interview a film professional, and this week we are pleased to be joined by costume designer Amy Higdon, whose work on episodes include Reservation Dogs, the Martin Scorsese film Killers of the Flower Moon, and most recently, the Apple TV film Fancy Dance. Welcome to the show, Amy. I'm so excited to have you here to talk with us about costume design.
Hi,
Uh,
I'm so excited to be here. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. I first want to ask about I read an interesting story about you. Um, Costume design was more an afterthought. How did you get into costume design? Let me ask you about that. In terms of the various places where someone can go in terms of the filmmaking collective. You got into costume design.
Yeah, I am. I've loved movies my whole life, and never really thought that there was a place for me until I was about 16, and I started to take more notice of the costume design in film. And I would stay after, the movie was over and watch the credits roll and like learn the names of the costume designers. And it just kind of seemed to be a combination of all the things I was good at and had an interest in. I've always been pretty artistic. I've always liked fashion. I've always loved history. And so all of that together is costume design. And that was kind of the area that I found that I could flourish in. So that's how I got into it.
So it was really like you just wanted to be in movies and then found a place for you.
Yeah, I wanted to be involved in the storytelling, and yeah, costume design was just the way that I felt like I could contribute and contribute like well to it. Like that's where I was going to be the most successful. So,
My friends and I would make little videos in our backyards, imitations of Indiana Jones and Star Wars. Eventually that need to tell stories became more of a technical interest and an interest in the art. To me, what's exciting is using cinema in its full potential, which is rhythm and sound design and music. Our job is to set up expectations and then deliver on them. I'm Brian Cates, and this is my course in film editing.
So on a film like Fancy Dance, when you are introduced to the script or you're introduced to the story or you're taken onto a team, when does costume design start? Because this is outside of my wheelhouse. And so when do you start thinking about costumes for the characters? Does it happen before casting or does it happen after casting, or is there initial prep, or is there drawings, or how does that work?
yeah, I mean, it depends, but oftentimes you might know who's playing a couple characters here and there, but a lot of the casting is finalized sort of like as the process moves along during prep and sometimes into filming. I knew that Lily was attached to the project, and so right from the get, I could imagine Lily in the role of Jax and start designing for with her in mind. Um, Isabel came through like maybe like a couple of days after Lily is when I knew Isabel was cast as Roki. Yeah, and I mean, I came on about a month before filming started, so at the beginning of prep, really, which was it's a short prep time on an indie movie like this. We only had 3 weeks. So from the first time I read the script, I was trying to start imagining clothes and start analyzing the characters. So I felt like I would be prepared in such a truncated prep time to start shopping as soon as we hit the ground, basically. So yeah.
So what were you hoping to do with Lily as a Jax character in terms of design? Like what were you envisioning really?
Yeah, so Jax, I think sort of the design brief is like functional because she's in survival mode. Her day can look like many different things. They're out when we first meet them. She's at a creek gathering plant medicines. They ride their bike around on rural roads. And she says she's just, she's working hard to save $50. So she doesn't have a lot of money. All of it goes into surviving and taking care of Roki. So function and thriftiness were a couple of key things, but Erica wanted to infuse her with a little bit of coolness and a little bit of swagger, and we definitely didn't want to lose that in the function of these garments. And so um I thought of these girls that I went to high school with and played basketball with. They kind of reminded me of Jax. And so because I grew up in a small town in Oklahoma and I'm indigenous, and the town I grew up in, there were a lot of native people around. And so yeah, so I thought about this more like mask, androgynous, more based in athletic wear type aesthetic, and then tried to infuse it with a little bit of that coolness like Erica was talking about. So like the gold chain and like, you know, cuffs her pants and cuts off her t-shirt sleeves and that kind of thing. So functional yet cool was kind of the design brief on Jax.
So it's an interesting idea because I think, you know, it's this part of the story is this nature of this, you know, involuntary, you know, mother character. You know, Jax
Mm-hmm.
becomes her, you know, fill-in replacement mother. But the nature of her character is not maternal at all. You know, doesn't have a sense of maternal, you know, doesn't have that maternal instinct because, you know, because of that's her character, and you know, never saw herself as that. And like you said, she's living in the moment there. And so I think it's interesting that you mentioned before about the idea of kind of survival, is that she's just trying to take care of herself. And now, you know, there's you know, in the costume, there's not a sense of, you know, a maternal figure. It's more just independent figure.
Well, I think that I'm going to disagree with you a little bit
Okay.
because I think Jax is has always been there for her family. You know, they
Sure.
talk about how like she took care of her mom, and she obviously like just stepped right in pretty seamlessly when Towie went missing. And so I think that there's no right or wrong way to be a woman or a matriarch in your family. And I think that that's what this film touches on, is that like these matriarchal roles and caregiving tasks, like they're the responsibility of every woman in the tribe. And you know,
Yeah.
Roki says like auntie in the Cayuga language means other mother or little mother. And so like from the get, Jax was always going to, you know, have to fulfill that role for Roki, even if her mom was still around. And so there's a responsibility there that she has never shirked, I don't think. But you know, that doesn't mean that she can't be authentically herself and be a woman in the way that she feels she is. So that's all I would say to that. Yeah.
Yeah. Do you think did you approach Roki to look up to Jax in costume or design? It seemed like that Roki came into the film, was introduced in the film as kind of a mini Jax, and it, you know, it was the sleeveless T-shirt and the you know, and the, you know, the very tough look kind of thing. Was there
Yeah.
some thought going into that as an approach?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, when I initially found that wolf t-shirt we found at thrifting, I thought it was going to go on Jax, and I envisioned it in Jax's closet. And Erica Tremblay, the director, had the idea about Roki maybe wearing it. And that's when like I feel like Roki's closet kind of clicked into place, and it's like, yeah, this is one of Jax's old t-shirts, but Roki threw it on to go to the creek, you know. And I think that also speaks to the presence of Jax in her life even before Towie went missing. Like she obviously idolizes her aunt and has been learning from her quite a bit. And so Roki's at this point in girlhood, like right before I think you're really like hyper aware of how the world is perceiving you. You're just kind of like, you know, throwing clothes on and just thinking about yourself when you're putting clothes on. And I think girls get to a certain point where unfortunately they start to think of how others perceive them in the clothes they're wearing, and Roki's not
Yeah.
quite there yet. And so she's just trying to emulate the women in her life that she loves and looks up to, and that's Jax and that's her mom. Yeah, so glad
Yeah,
you
I
picked
think
up on
it's
that.
yeah, no, I think it's interesting because I noticed there's kind of a shift where you know, you mentioned Jack's androgyny, that Roki comes along as kind of this miniature version of her, and then, you know, starts looking at her mom, or the, you know, the purple jacket with the
Mm-hmm.
frills, and starts looking at the high heels, and that becomes this kind of like, you know, like you were talking about, this kind of transitional point in her, you know, she's getting her period, and now she's, you know, thinking about how she's perceived in terms of, you know, this, there's a lot of contrast between, you know, I guess androgyny and what would be, you know, stereotypical traditional femininity of the costuming as she's trying on different kind of personas.
Yeah, sure. And I also think, you know, like the androgyny, it's, you know, Jax as a queer woman is a little bit more interested in this mask aesthetic, but I also think that like it's really a common style amongst Native communities, especially rural Native communities, is like those cutoff t-shirts and that emphasis on athletic wear. I think that's also just sort of a hallmark of Indigenous fashion. And so I think that's present as well. This is just like kind of like what a lot of girls on the res grow up wearing. I grew up wearing cut off t-shirts, and you know, these girls that I played basketball with in high school, it was the t-shirt game was important. And Roki wears like a Delaware powwow t-shirt at one point. It's like that's a pretty sick t-shirt. And so people notice those things, I think, in rural Native communities, and it's like, oh man, yeah, you were at that powwow, that's cool, and you know, things like that. So there is the idea of her sort of like growing into a woman that's obviously present. I kind of think of this as a coming of age story for Roki by and large, but also, you know, it's just kind of part of the community that she's into is this sort of style choice.
So in terms of preserving that, in terms of providing some sense of authenticity, you mentioned coming from, you know, being Indigenous and you're shooting in Oklahoma in these locations where it's tribal communities. What was important, and how did you approach, you know, preserving those traditional values and customs of these Indigenous tribes in terms of costume design?
Yeah, I think I've heard Sterling Harjo say something similar to this before, where he's like, as long as I'm telling the truth, like I feel good about it. And that was sort of the attitude that we had an approach to these costumes. The script, I mean, like I said, as soon as I read the script, I was like, I feel like I grew up with Jax. Like I know so many women like Jax in my community, and Roki too. And so it was really about like, I want those women in these communities to see themselves in those characters, and being as authentic as I possibly can to like who they are in the present day. I think is the best way to preserve that, those like more traditional customs and stuff, is to be true to who they are in the present, you know, because there's there's a lot of Native communities all over the country that have never seen themselves represented in a way like from their perspective. And so that was sort of our northern light the whole time. And Erica really like was really great in like making sure I stayed on that path and being like, you know, like, no, like let's not you know, go down that path. The one we're on is good and we need to stay on it. And so yeah, so I think just trying my best to have the Native community in mind, the Native audience in mind, first and foremost, before everything else. They were kind of the only ones that we wanted to make sure really felt seen on camera, and so I think we did that. Yeah.
Probably one of the smartest things I've ever done for my career. It gave me all the tools that I needed to be able to jump into a new career.
Getting myself into a mindset, thinking like an editor, and being around people that I can talk to on that level was really invaluable to me.
A lot of the things that I learned from that class, I still think about.
I loved the classroom. I loved the computer stations. We built a sense of community.
And it also instills a lot of confidence in you to take that and go out into the world.
After I took the class, I felt very prepared to take the next step.
I owe Manhattan Workshop the career that I have right now.
Things have been going great, and I really have the Manhattan Workshop to thank for that.
And the entire set design crew, or the entire costume design crew, was Indigenous people, right? There was
I had a crew of 4, I think, and yeah, all Indigenous women, all from Oklahoma, all from different tribes. We were all from different places, which helped, I think, a lot. And there were times when we could use each other as a sounding board and make sure that everything felt true to the Oklahoma Native community.
You mentioned Sterling Harjo, and when I was watching this, I was thinking about Reservation Dogs, and thinking about that as was there from working on that working an episode of that show, was there a thought in there about at any point were you comparing the work you were doing between those two, between that show and that film?
Yeah, I don't know about comparison so much as like it was really about like this was so indigenous women led and about Erica's story and Michiana's story. Michiana at least co-wrote the script with Erica Tremblay. And so it wasn't so much comparison as an extension of this like wonderful Native film community that Sterling Harjo has kind of built out here in Tulsa. And you know, a lot of the background actors that we used in Fancy Dance, they're also in Reservation Dogs. They were on Killers of the Flower Moon. And so it's less how Erica and Sterling's work compares to each other and more about just this extension of this wonderful Native community where Native people are in the director's chair and in the writing room, and they are the ones telling the story. It's not somebody else telling our story for us and inviting us along for the ride, like it's us. And so I think that's really, really special. Yeah.
I was going to ask you about that, but you sort of answered it. But I would hope that you could speak more about it. So with Reservation Dogs and Killers of the Flower Moon and now Fancy Dance, you know, it is, you know, there's more stories being told now, and that is a positive thing. Do you foresee that continuing to grow? And is the opportunities there? And you know, are we concerned about Hollywood just kind of doing what Hollywood does sometimes and not telling those stories as well as they can? Or do you see that this is going to be, you know, will there be potentially a new rise in stories of Native Americans and stories of Indigenous people?
I think that, you know, we can't rely on Hollywood to always tell our stories the way they should be told or even invite us along to tell our stories. And so I think that there is an emphasis on Native filmmakers making their own stuff and doing it themselves. And I think that can be a really beautiful thing. I mean, it resulted in Fancy Dance, you know, and I think that I like to think that because there are people that sort of busted down the door for like Native filmmakers, like Lily did it, Erica's doing it, Sterling's done it. I think there will be more people able to imagine themselves in that career, because that's the thing, when you're from a marginalized community, especially like a rural community, and an indigenous community, it's hard to imagine that there's a place for you in mainstream entertainment. And I think what this wonderful generation of filmmakers and artists has done is show that like we can do it from no matter where we're from or where we're starting from. Like we can tell our own stories and be successful doing that and just reaching our own audience.
Yeah, I mean, there is this nature of, you know, kind of you know, breaking down the door as an idea in any art form, whether you talk about, you know, in music, in in indigenous punk bands, you know, like, which was never a thing, you know, became, you know, a thing, or, you know, indigenous, you know, hip hop bands, or, you know, you talk about, you know, female representation, women in filmmaking and women in music and women in art had to, you know, oppose, you know, what the traditional canon thought it should be. And so there is that hope that, you know, those stories are able to be told because they're fascinating stories, and they're rich with a lot of stuff that, you know, mainstream society doesn't get to see. In terms of Fancy Dance, how much freedom do you think you were given by the director? Was there, you know, initial sketches that were said, or was it just kind of free reign to approach this how you wanted? Or I don't know, how were you directed in terms of this?
Yeah, I wouldn't say, like, I don't know, it felt like I had free reign, but I think that's because Erica and I were on the same page a lot of the time, which is a really beautiful thing. And I think it's another reason why it's important to have Indigenous people in all aspects of the film crew, because there's a shorthand that's there automatically. And there's a little bit more of a connection to each other that way. And so what I had kind of thought for Jax is essentially what we went with. And I think Erica did a wonderful job of just curating my ideas into something coherent for her movie, which is what, you know, a good director does. And so there were, I mean, you know, she's the one that wrote in the script a purple jacket with long fringe, you know, like that jacket wouldn't exist if she hadn't written it down, if she hadn't had that image in her head. And so I think it really felt like a true collaboration of sorts. And, you know, there was definitely some editing that happened, but it needed to happen, and it's better for it. And so I was really grateful to have that as my first experience with a director as a costume designer on a feature. It was really wonderful.
So there's what I noticed in the film, there's a nature of, and I don't know how to describe it really, of generations, of different generations of indigenous people, and also different parts of society. What was how was that approached, and what was the thinking going into kind of capturing those different age groups of different, you know, generations of people who live these experiences?
Yeah, I mean, I think that goes back to just you know, making sure it felt true. And, you know, we had shooting in Oklahoma in a Native community already kind of helps that, because there's people around that just look like that, you know. And so I think there's a scene where they're walking through a field calling Tawi's name, and there's an elder there that you may have noticed wearing a purple shirt. Her name's Casey Camp Hornak, and she's a legendary Native activist slash actor. She's also in Reservation Dogs. And she has a wonderful closet of her own, and she tends to like bring options to the show. And the color of purple was sort of the color of love in our piece, and it's also the color of wampum, which is a really important material and significant in Haudenosaunee society, which is the culture that these characters come from. And so Casey was pulling out her stuff, and I was like, she had this beautiful purple blouse, she had a wampum jewelry set already, and I was like, can you please wear this? And she was like, I was hoping you would pick this one. So so I think it was just so, I can't stress enough how like community based it all felt. And just as long as we were staying true to kind of like the real people in our own lives that we knew that sort of reminded us of these characters, we were on the right track.
In terms of that, you mentioned like closets. These actors and these characters, well, these actors are, you know, for most of the film are mostly indigenous people, mostly Native Americans. How much of that came from their own closets, or how much of that came from, you know, you mentioned this elder's character, but you know, how much did they already own that made your job a little bit easier?
Yeah, actually, we sourced everything for everybody ourselves except for Casey Camp, just because she's such an icon, and she knows what to bring to the table and how to make it work. But yeah, no, like all of Jax's clothes, all of Roki's clothes, Frank, Nancy, even like JJ, Jax's brother, like we sourced all of their closets, either shopping or of course had something built, like the purple jacket was built for this show specifically. Yeah, and we thrifted a lot in Tulsa to kind of work with our budget, which I think led to some really exciting pieces. Like that wolf t-shirt came from a thrift store, and there's a t-shirt that a character wears when she's talking to Jax at the community center. She's like kind of a social worker, is her profession in the show. And so we found a t-shirt that was for like some kind of like youth 5K run, like to benefit like local schools or something. And so like that went on her. And so yeah, no, we sourced everything ourselves except for Casey Camp. She knows what she's doing.
Yeah.
So.
Very cool. Very cool. I have to ask, how challenging was the powwow scene? In terms of costuming, in terms of ideas, in terms of how you wanted to look, in terms of color, and those kind of things. Because that feels like the Super Bowl of costume design.
Yeah, which and actually, you know, the regalia and the powwow, I guess I misspoke when I said we sourced everything, because the regalia and the powwow, the community brought themselves.
Sure.
Because, I mean, powwow regalia, it's so deeply, deeply personal to the individual, and the time and labor that goes into these garments and their accessories and all of their finery. It takes so many hours, and it takes really highly skilled people, and it's almost all done in the home or within the community. You can't like go to a store and buy that unless you're willing to drop a lot of cash. And so so we relied on the community to come wearing their regalia, and they showed up, they showed out, they helped us out a lot. And it's, I think even if I had had all the time and money in the world, I would have rather used people's personal regalia if they were willing to let us put it on screen, because I think it's so rich and it's so individual, and nobody's regalia looks the same, because it's often like sort of the mind meld of the person wearing it and their loved ones that are making it for them, and the tribe that they come from, the clan that they come from, what style of dance they're doing. It's so individual. I mean, it's like I keep comparing them to couture pieces because that's the level.
Sure.
And so, yeah, so the powwow, I mean, I know it was a lot to coordinate with the production themselves, but for us as costume designers, you know, we told them, we were like, you know, make sure you're wearing something that you are comfortable with the world seeing. Some people, you know, might want to hold things back just for themselves, and we wanted to make sure that they were aware of that. But no, they were there. It was astonishing how generous and enthusiastic everybody was with their time and with their regalia and with their expertise in dancing. And so that was really, really special, actually. And like I said, I think that scene is so rich and so moving because each individual in the community contributed to it.
Yeah, I think that's interesting because it's kind of about two things you said about the idea of the authenticity, you know, whereas I might not notice, being from outside perspective, not noticing, you know, whether that, I think to maintain the authenticity, I think, you know, that community will notice if it's not real. If the regalia isn't up to snuff, it's like, if it looks like, you know, someone spent an afternoon putting something together really quickly, they'll go, no, this is not, you know. And, you know, you're making a film for the general public, but you're also making a film, you know, that showcases and, you know, interests that community, and is written for that community first and foremost. And so you can't half step into it. You know, you have to have it be real and have it be authentic, and people will know if they're from you know, whatever community they're from, they'll know, nah, that's not a true thing. And so it has to be real. And I also think that in terms of that, you know, you mentioned before about motherhood, about there's a different approach to parenting. It's not necessarily like you have a mom, it's that you have a community that takes care of you, and you have a community that takes care of you. And so for your production, you know, you're making this film as this work of art, and the community is coming together. You know, this community that's known for working together as a community is coming together to be a community that says, hey, you know, you need this, we got you. And the community comes in and helps in and does that. So it speaks to that really, really well. I have one more question, and it is obviously a silly question that we always ask everybody. Do you have something, a guilty pleasure, that you watch at the end of a long day, or some TV show or movie that you do just to unplug and be kind of, you know, take it easy?
Yeah, I've been watching Bridgerton recently.
Wow.
Yeah, I have. I love Nicola Coughlan, and the costume design on that show is wonderful and kooky and crazy, but also perfect for the vibe of the show. So yeah, I've been watching Bridgerton. That's my guilty pleasure right now.
Good. There's nothing wrong with that at all. Amy, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure learning from you. I really appreciate it. I've learned so much. That's going to be it for us this week. You can check us out on filmmakeru.com or follow us on Instagram at filmmaker_u. I am Chad Anderson. Thank you again, Amy, and thank you everyone else so much for watching.